Physiology, Section 3, Skeletal Muscle. This is Chapter 2, Skeletal Muscle Mechanics. All right, let's talk a little bit about muscle mechanics. And we're going to talk in this chapter, we're going to focus everything on skeletal muscle mechanics, but they're going to be very, very applicable. These mechanics will be very applicable for the heart, striated muscle. So not only will we need this for step 1 skeletal muscle, we're going to need it for USMLE step 1 because it's going to relate to cardiac, which is in the next section, again, section 4 of the book. All right, we're going to have two different loads that we need to know and appreciate. The first is called preload. Preload is the load on the muscle before it contracts. If I apply a preload to a muscle, it's going to do two things. Number one, it's going to stretch the muscle, which in turn stretches the sarcomere. So putting a load on the muscle before it contracts, preload, stretches the muscle. And the greater the preload, the greater the stretch, which should make sense. Hopefully that follows logically. Second, this preload is going to generate what we call a passive tension. Here's the way to think about it. Think about skeletal muscle as like a rubber band. It has elasticity. It wants to snap back. It resists stretch. So as I start putting more and more of a load on a muscle in a relaxed state, so in other words, I just start pulling a rubber band, you can feel the tension on the finger holding the rubber band. You can do this. Just take a rubber band, put your finger through it, and then just pull on one end of it, and you will feel the tension. This is passive tension because it's created by preload. Preload is the load before it contracts, and that's why it generates a passive tension. Okay? This passive tension is that resistance to stretch, that elasticity of the muscle or the elasticity of the rubber band. Now, the greater the preload, the greater the stretch, and in turn, the greater the passive tension. Just pull on that rubber band. The more you pull it, the greater the force you're pulling it with, the more force you will feel on the finger holding the rubber band. Muscle is very, very similar. So again, preload is the load on the muscle before it contracts. It stretches the sarcomere, and because of the properties of the muscle, the elasticity of the muscle, it will generate a passive tension. We'll show this graphically in just a moment. The second load is afterload. Afterload is the load that the muscle works against. Imagine that you want to lift a 10-kilo weight. Okay? That's the afterload. If you want to pick up a pencil, you want to pick up a bottle to take a drink of water or your coffee mug, that's the afterload. That's the load that the muscle is working against. So that's afterload for skeletal muscle. All right, utilizing this 10-kilo weight, there are two possibilities. That's the afterload. So if I engage that afterload and I contract my muscle, and my muscle can generate more than 10 kilos of force, then the weight will move. Imagine taking a dumbbell that's 10 kilos and trying to move it towards your face, doing a curl, what's called a curl in exercise. If you can generate more than 10 kilo with your muscle, then the muscle shortens. That's an isotonic contraction, which we mentioned in the previous chapter. Now, if your muscle is unable to generate more than 10 kilos of force, then the muscle won't shorten. That's an isometric contraction. So you can imagine that there are afterloads out there in which are going to force you to perform an isometric contraction. Say, for example, you try to lift a car. Well, you're engaging the muscle, you're getting cross-spread cycling, you're generating tension, but your muscle can't generate enough tension to lift that car, at least for most people. So we have two types of loads, preload and afterload, and we're going to have three types of tension. The first is passive tension. This is the tension we just described is produced by the preload, the stretching of the muscle. Second type of tension is active tension, which we mentioned in the previous chapter. That's actin and myosin interacting, cross-bridge cycling. That's what produces active tension. And then hopefully it makes sense that the total tension is just the sum of the two, active and passive. Okay, here's a picture of, say, a muscle. And for right now, let's just not worry about this infinite afterload that's in the book. So A represents a muscle that has zero preload on it. We're not putting any load on it. So imagine the rubber band, and you're just holding the rubber band up. That's A. There is no preload on the muscle. Now we take this muscle, and we put a little load on it, a 1 gram weight on it. Okay, that's what's illustrated in B. Now notice that it stretches the muscle out. So you can just imagine, or you can do at home, you can just kind of slightly pull the rubber band a little bit taut. And that would be like B. So the 1 gram here represents the preload. And notice that we go from no passive tension to a passive tension of 1. Now we put a greater preload, 5 grams, and the muscle stretches more. Just pull harder on the rubber band. It will stretch more, and you will feel that force on your finger. So the 5 gram weight here is stretching the muscle, and it produces a greater passive tension. In this example, 5. So notice, by adding more and more preload, we are stretching the muscle. This is going to relate to what we call a length-tension relationship. Let's plot this passive tension on the next slide. So this illustrates muscle length on the X, tension on the Y. And let's just pay attention for right now to the green curve, the passive tension curve. A represents the muscle when we had zero preload. So say the muscle is approximately 3 units length. It's just sitting there, there's no load on it, so it's not developing tension. That's why tension is 0. Next, we put a weight on it. We put a little preload. Well, that preload stretched the muscle. And that stretch of the muscle generates some passive tension. And that's why the curve starts to go up. This B is what we had on the previous slide, which was simply the 1 gram weight preload. So again, B on the graph is B on this picture where we put 1 gram preload, load on the muscle before it contracts, and it stretched the muscle out. On the graph, we're just graphing the quantity of the passive tension, which in this example is 1 gram. C represents when we put the 5 grams of tension on. We stretched the muscle out more, and it generated a greater passive tension. So again, preload, that load on the muscle before it contracts. What that preload does is stretch the muscle, so notice that muscle length goes up, and as I stretch the muscle, I have a passive tension associated with it. And that's the basis of the green line and why it's called a passive tension curve. Let's go back to our muscle. At the 3 different preloads, A was 0 preload, B was a little preload, and C was more preload. Now what we're going to do is we're going to stimulate that muscle to maximally contract at each of those preloads. But we're going to put on an infinite afterload. And don't get too bogged down with the idea of infinite afterload. Bottom line, it means the muscle doesn't shorten. So we're going to evoke a maximal isometric contraction. In reality, how much that afterload is doesn't really matter. Let's say that you can't lift 100 kilos. Well, it's not going to matter if you're trying to lift 100 kilos or 1,000 kilos. You can't shorten your muscle on either one. It's an isometric contraction either way. So effectively, the afterload is infinite. So again, we're going to put infinite afterload. We're not allowing the muscle to shorten, and we're going to stimulate it to contract at the 3 different preloads, A, B, and C. And we're going to record the active tension. Here's the graph illustrating the active tension. We still have the passive tension curve in green. Now we're going to bring in the active tension curve in purple. So we're stimulating the muscle, isometric contraction. We're going to start at A, in which we had no preload. So there was no muscle length, no passive tension. At that no preload state, we generate about that much force by cross-spread cycling. That's what's illustrated on the graph. Now, as I stretch the muscle, as I provide a little preload B, notice that the active tension goes up. Now, at the higher preload C, notice that active tension begins to fall. So the purple line represents a bell-shaped active tension curve. When I have little to no preload, I have a certain amount of tension. Now, as I add preload and stretch the muscle, the active tension starts going up, and it goes up to a certain peak. Thereafter, more and more stretch causes less and less active tension, until we get to the point where there is 0 active tension. So this is a bell-shaped active tension curve. And notice that the preload of B, we have the maximal active tension. This is referred to as L0, length optimal. At B, this is where we get the highest active tension. So this is the optimal length for getting maximal tension. So again, B represents L0, and that's that length in which I get maximal active tension. Again, the purple line is active tension. If I go below L0, I get less active tension. If I go above L0, I get less active tension. We'll talk about on the next slide why that is. All right, we had a bell-shaped active tension curve. The question becomes, why is that? Well, notice where the arrow is on the slide. What we're looking at is a tiny sarcomere. When I had no preload, notice how the actin filaments overlap with one another. So we have some actin filaments that are not seen or not bound to or not responding to the myosin. And so the muscle can't generate as much tension. If I go all the way over here to the very high preload, notice how I am pulling the muscle, and now actin is being pulled away from the myosin. So there are myosin heads that cannot interact with actin, and so I get less active tension. Hopefully it makes sense to you that the active tension is going to be directly related to the number of cross bridges that can form. And if every actin and every myosin, so in other words, every myosin head is seeing actin, then I'm going to get the maximal force. And that's what's occurring at the preload of 1 gram. That's, remember on our previous graph, is L0. So when I provide this level of preload or muscle stretch, I align the actin and myosin so I have optimal overlap of actin and myosin, and therefore I get the greatest active tension. Once again, active tension is cross-bridge cycling. That means actin, myosin binding together, the myosin tugging on actin. So that is the mechanism, that is the rationale for the bell-shaped curve. Not too much, not too little. Goldilocks and the 3 bears. It has to be just right. We need a just right amount of stretch in order to get the highest level of active tension. That's L0. All right, next big concept related to muscle. Again, striated muscle, really focusing on skeletal muscle for step 1, is this graph, which is a relationship between velocity and load. Notice, Notice the axes, afterload on the x, velocity on the y. At the arrows is where we have the y-intercept of this graph. This is maximum velocity of shortening, or in other words, V max. This occurs when there is no afterload on the muscle. Now, B is generating a greater maximum velocity than A, because the y-intercept is higher for B than A. All right, let's think about this. Let's see if we can do a demonstration. Stretch your arm out. Don't put anything in your hand. And if you contract your bicep, then you're going to bring your hand towards your face. Now, if you have nothing in your hand, you have no afterload. So think about how fast, or you can do it, think about how fast you can bring your hand to your face when you have no afterload. Hopefully that makes sense. So when there's no afterload, I have the highest velocity, or in other words, V max. This graph shows that as I increase afterload, I decrease velocity. Try picking up a book and bringing it toward your face by contracting the bicep rapidly. Make sure you don't hit yourself in the head with the book. But the heavier the book, the slower the contraction. That's what this graph is saying. As afterload goes up, the velocity goes down. And hopefully that makes good sense with that basic little illustration. Now we get to the point where afterload exceeds the maximum force generated by the muscle. Now the muscle doesn't shorten. So this represents, where we drew the arrows, the x-intercept represents maximal isometric force, which we talked about in our experimental, or that setup, in the previous slide. So this represents an isometric contraction. So maximal isometric force, that's the x-intercept. And again, the y-intercept is maximum velocity of shortening, V max. This slide just illustrates, and that's why we have the asterisks there. Again, the y-intercept is V max. Now, what determines V max? That will be the properties of the myosin ATPase. The faster the ATPase, the faster the velocity of shortening. If we think about it, if we go back to our crossbred cycling, to our details that we discussed in the first chapter of skeletal muscle, actin and myosin bind. This binding is then dissociated by the binding of ATP to myosin. Now, myosin has an ATPase, and if you think about it, the faster I can split the ATP and the ADP in phosphate, the quicker the myosin returns to its high energy, high affinity state and can therefore bind again. So the faster I chop that ATP, the quicker the myosin converts. Remember, when ATP bound, it was in a low affinity, low energy state. But then, boom, I split that ATP, immediately puts it in a high energy, high affinity state. And if calcium is still around, tropomyosin's out of the way, and actin and myosin can rebind. So maximum velocity is therefore directly related to how fast I can split ATP. In other words, myosin ATPase activity. The double asterisk just indicates, again, this is maximal isometric force. There is no velocity of shortening, so we know it's an isometric contraction. All right, another aspect related to skeletal muscle for step 1 that we need to know are the different types of muscle fibers. Now, if you look at this force velocity curve, we have A and B. And if you can just remember this curve, you've got half of what you need to know for step 1. Just think of A as being a red muscle and B being a white muscle. B has a higher y-intercept, so white muscle has a higher velocity, maximum velocity, V max, than red muscle. B also has a greater x-intercept. So white muscle, B, generates more force in general than red muscle. So white muscle is faster, and more powerful. Some more properties of white muscle. Again, we indicated that it's more powerful. It's utilized short term. Ocular muscles are an example, the leg muscles of a sprinter. It has a large mass per motor unit, and it is fast. It has a high ATP-ACE activity, as we indicated before. Line B on our force velocity curve. It's more powerful. It has a very high capacity for anaerobic glycolysis because it has a low level of myoglobin. Remember, myoglobin is that oxygen binding protein. As a result, white muscle, anaerobic glycolysis, this is going to be the muscle that releases lactate. This high capacity for anaerobic rather than aerobic means it's going to fatigue quickly. So it's powerful, it's fast, but it doesn't last long. And it will release lactate. Red muscle, on the other hand, again, the A, or the green line on our force velocity curve, these are less powerful, and these are used long term. These are endurance muscles, like the postural muscles of the back. They have a small mass per motor unit. They have a low ATP-ACE activity, so they are slow. They have a lot of mitochondria compared to the white muscle, so they're really adapted for aerobic metabolism, and they have a lot of myoglobin. That's why it's called red muscle, because of the appearance of myoglobin. Just think of a chicken. Think of a chicken. Let's think of a chicken leg. So you have the drumstick of a chicken. Well, that's dark muscle, right? That's dark meat. Well, that's red. Chickens can run. They can run for a long time. They can just run and run and run. But if we think about a chicken breast, that's white meat. Chickens can't fly for a very long time. So they don't have good endurance for flying because it's white meat. If you think about duck, the breast of a duck, if you've ever had duck breast for dinner, that's a very dark meat. Lot of myoglobin, high capacity for aerobic metabolism, doesn't fatigue quickly, and that's why a duck can fly and fly, all the way around the world. Some ducks, right? All right, the very last part of this chapter is just some basic comparisons to make sure we've got an idea of differences between skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. We don't go into the details of smooth muscle and physiology. That gets covered by pharmacology. Again, skeletal and cardiac are striated. Smooth is not striated. Smooth muscle is not organized into sarcomeres like it is in skeletal and cardiac. Cardiac and smooth muscles have gap junctions, which creates an electrical sensation they can contract in unison. It's not true for skeletal muscle. That requires a discharge in an alpha motor neuron, and each fiber is innervated. As we mentioned before, both cardiac and skeletal have troponin to bind calcium. A little bit different in smooth muscle has the calcium binding protein calmodulin to bind calcium. Skeletal muscle is very fast. It has a very high ATP-ACE activity. Smooth muscle is very slow, so it has a low ATP-ACE activity. And the heart is in between. As you would predict, skeletal muscle has a very extensive sarcoplasmic reticulum because all calcium comes from the SR, whereas smooth muscle has a very limited sarcoplasmic reticulum. The heart is somewhere in between. Both of them utilize extracellular calcium for contraction. The SR, sarcoplasmic reticulum, is controlled by second messengers in smooth muscle by and large. Second messengers will modulate the heart, the cardiac muscle. Okay? We still utilize T-tubules, sarcoplasmic reticulum near the Z lines for cardiac, but second messengers can modulate cardiac, and second messengers are not involved in the contraction aspect of skeletal muscle. As we already indicated, sarcolemma of skeletal muscle does not have calcium channels, no calcium fluxes across. all calcium comes from the SR. Cardiac and smooth, they do have calcium channels, voltage-gated calcium channels, because calcium will come from the extracellular space and participate in contraction for both cardiac and smooth, but not for skeletal muscle. All right, that ends skeletal muscle, but again, remember these mechanics and cross-bridge cycling and all the cellular aspects, very, very applicable for cardiac muscle, which is covered in the next section, or section 4. So, very important for understanding muscle function for step 1, skeletal muscle function, but also very, very important for the foundation of the pump, cardiac muscle. So, very important chapter, very high yield information for step 1.